there are moments where I really fancy a drink, but I just can't afford the impact or the consequence of that. Or not that I can't afford it, it's that I'm not willing to compromise that.
Was there a moment that you thought, if I don't do this now, somebody else might come along and build it?
I think to the point I made earlier about not having a million ideas a minute, it was probably one of those ones where I was like, if I don't do this, I'm probably not going to have another idea for at least another 5 years. We always say alcohol-free wine has historically been terrible. In the same way that alcohol-free beer was once terrible, and people of a certain age will remember a product called Caliber and a chuckle, and they're like, oh God, that was terrible, but now I love Lucky Saint, or Days, or Big Drop, or Guinness 0.0. That's changed completely. People will often say, like, isn't that just for pregnant women, or religious people, or someone on medication? You're like, those may be reasons for that person to consume a non-alcoholic product, but actually, if you look at the vast majority of consumers, they're just looking for a different option, a better option at a certain moment. If everyone there has a beer or a glass of wine and you've got a Coke in your hand, people are asking you questions. Why are you not drinking? Are you okay? What's going on? And actually, a lot of people, if they're not drinking, don't want to have that conversation. They just want to be able to blend in.
Before we get into today's episode, I want to give a shout out to a special sponsor, Sam Lawrence Recruitment. We all know that finding the right people or the right job can feel really overwhelming, and that's exactly where Sam comes in. He really just gets it. It's not just about ticking boxes, it's about connecting the right people with the right opportunities. He takes the time to understand you and exactly what you're looking for, whether you're building a team or taking that next career leap. So definitely get in touch. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Charlie is a 3-time founding member of Startup Brands, taking each from 0 to 1 million within 18 months. Across different categories, channels and countries, including launching operations in the US and Australia. He is now the founder of Plug-in Brands, an award-winning outsourced FMCG sales agency working with the fast-growth food and drink brands, and Dive-In Agency, a TikTok shop agency helping brands turn social commerce into real revenue. With a background in go-to market strategy, brand development and distribution through retail and wholesale channels, there isn't anyone better placed to help you supercharge your brand. Charlie and the Plug-in Brands team work with a host of brands, including Moju, Muller, Clipper Tea, Who Gives a Crap, and Lovecorn. So if you're in need of an extra pair of hands to really step on your growth this year, Charlie is the guy you need to be in touch with. Getting to Grow is also brought to you by the Coconut Collab. And full disclosure, as I'm sure most of you are aware, I work there, so I know how much love goes into everything that we make. We're all about creating delicious, dairy-free, plant-based treats that do not compromise on taste. From our creamy yogurts to our indulgent desserts, everything's made with coconuts and a whole lot of care. If you're looking for something naturally good but seriously tasty, and my favourite is just our natural coconut yogurt, I have it most mornings with granola and lots of honey. Trust me, you're going to absolutely love it. Welcome to another episode of Getting to Grow. On this week's episode, we have Luke Hemsley. I said it wrong, didn't I?
You did, yeah, but that's okay. That's okay. What a way to start. Let's roll with Hemsley. Hemsley, but everyone says Hemsley, so you're not the first. Luke
Hemsley, the founder of Wednesday's Domaine.
That's right.
I love the branding so much. I'm obsessed, and I was very kindly sent some in the week. So I was trying it because I've had a lot of non-alc, and I've not loved it.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, I genuinely enjoyed this, and I really it's so hard, I think, to get non-alc nice. In my opinion, I've tried so many, and I've just not been a fan. So we'll get into all of that.
Absolutely.
But Luke, would you please introduce yourself and tell me kind of your journey into starting the business?
Yeah, of course. And I guess first thing to say, Zoe, is thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be here. So I'm Luke Hemsley, or Luke Hemsley, founder of Wednesday's Domaine. We are an alcohol-free wine business on a mission to become the midweek wine alternative for food and drink lovers. My background, which is probably very relevant for a lot of people listening today, is not actually in food and drink. It's in early stage startups. I realised quite early on in my career that I wanted to set up a business. I was a commodities trader at the time and realised that I was probably destined to be a pretty bang average one for the rest of my career, and so decided to make the leap into startups. Spent 6 or 7 years working in early stage businesses and also helping to run a community through helping entrepreneurs through the highs and lows of building businesses. And so through that experience, I got a kind of ringside seat to startups and early stage businesses. And it was through that I realised that any business that I went on to set up had to have a physical product and some form of delightful customer experience. And that's kind of manifested or morphed into Wednesday's Domaine, which we'll speak a bit about today. And we can go into why alcohol-free wine and why ridiculous challenges like that, as you touched upon, but I won't kind of go much further than that at this stage.
And why, well, let's talk about why alcohol-free. So why alcohol-free for you, and why was that time in your life right to start the business?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think if I answer the second part first, so I mentioned that I spent a number of years in early stage businesses. So most recently I spent 5 years at a business called Fluidly. We had a product which helps small businesses manage their cash flow, and I joined there as the first employee, kind of pre-product, pre-revenue, pre-anything. It was the founder and me sitting in the corner of a smelly office, and that business kind of grew to 50, 60 people, raised a lot of money in the process, and ended up not quite working out. And at that point, I realised that it was probably a bit of a now or never situation in terms of setting up a business. Life was getting more serious, beginning to get a mortgage, thinking about a family, and I realised it was probably the right time to make the leap. Equally, I'm not someone who has a million ideas a minute. I'm not one of those characters, relatively kind of considered in that respect. And so I sat down and did some thinking about the type of business that I wanted to set up, and realised I basically looked at loads and loads of businesses, looking at things like Courier and Wired and startup, top 100 startups, and realised the businesses that I admired had two things in common: physical products and delightful customer experiences. And so that gave me the lens through which to look at opportunities. As for why alcohol-free, my wife and I were spending some time, this was kind of COVID when I had some time to think about this. My wife and I were spending time we stayed with her parents for a few months and then my parents for a few months. They're all just pretty old school in terms of, they like a glass of wine, they like a gin and tonic, they like a beer. And we were also doing that. We were having a drink most evenings. And I realised that it just wasn't particularly sustainable. It wasn't compatible with staying mentally and physically fit, working hard, albeit remotely. And so looked at some alcohol-free options, went to the local supermarket, and I was amazed at the variety on shelf when it came to beers and spirits. Took those products, lots of them, looked great, took them home and they tasted great. And that was a real surprise for me. Did the same with wine, and couldn't find very many. They didn't look particularly good, and when I got home, the liquids really weren't great. So figured that there was an opportunity for a great tasting, beautifully branded alcohol-free wine, and that's what we've tried to do with Wednesday's Domaine.
Interesting. It's so it's amazing actually. COVID was such an awful time for so many, but the amount of founders that I've had on the podcast that an amazing idea and their business has come out of. So it had so many cons, but it has had so many pros within people were at home, firstly spending more time with family. We're speaking about a very small population that had that opportunity, but it's amazing how many businesses did come out of COVID. And you're right, the drinking at home, I think as well, we didn't have much to do. So there was a lot of drinking in the evening, and we had gorgeous weather. I think if it had pissed it down for 4 months, we probably wouldn't have drank that much, or maybe more red than the gin and tonic in the garden. And I think actually you probably started the business when alcohol-free was in its real infancy and in the kind of category and what was coming out. So, with now when you look at there's so many options out there for an alcohol-free, and whether that is even just a Diet Coke to an alcohol-free wine, there is a mass amount of options now. So, it's really interesting, the businesses that did come out of a kind of weird place.
Definitely, and as you touched upon, Zoe, coming from a very lucky standpoint that I did still have a job. There was a home that I could go back to. We had a bit more space, and with that came time to think, because I still had a salary coming in, and I literally would get out of bed and walk to my desk, and that was that. And so you had that time to stop and, as I just said, think. In terms of alcohol-free, you're right, it was relatively early on. And I think it's interesting in terms of if you look at the evolution of alcohol-free, it was historically something that was... It was a kind of free-from back in the day, and it was a real backwater. It was a very dusty category. That was slowly beginning to evolve. That innovation was happening in beers and spirits, but not yet in wine. And the wines that existed spoke to customers in a very specific way. They were often emblazoned with 00 on the front, and if you were picking those products, they felt a bit like an afterthought, and they felt a bit like something you should maybe be a little bit embarrassed about. And that is central to what we're doing at Wednesday's Domaine. We want to elevate that experience of alcohol-free and to put it on a par with those who are drinking alcohol.
That's so true. I've never thought about the 00 thing. now you say that, if you are not drinking and maybe you don't want to like highlight it, you don't want to walk around with a fat 00 can. It's like really off-putting. So that's a really funny evolution that we've seen actually.
And there are levels of that. And if you think about, you know, a typical event that might happen in a city on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, if you're not drinking, or historically if you weren't drinking, your options were probably Coke or an orange juice. And a lot of people don't want to drink those because, you know, they don't want no one wants to drink 5 Diet Cokes in a row. No. But also there's a signalling element.
You'd be burping all the way home.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be horrible. But there's a signalling element, because if everyone there has a beer or a glass of wine and you've got a Coke in your hand, people are asking you questions. Why are you not drinking? Are you okay? What's going on? And actually a lot of people, if they're not drinking, don't want to have that conversation. They just want to be able to blend in. And it's really interesting. Anecdotally, a few years ago, you'd hear from landlords in pubs or people working behind bars in pubs that they would get people come to the bar and ask for 2 bottles of non-alc beer and a pint glass, and they would put them in together, and then it looks like they're having a pint. And actually that's now shifting quite a lot, where you're getting non-alcoholic beer on draft, but so much of it is about feeling part of the moment and being equal with the person opposite you.
Definitely. I think there's a huge thing in being equal. Like, we shouldn't have that. If you're not drinking, it shouldn't be a thing. You should just be able to it shouldn't even be brought up. But there is still that kind of slight stigma around it, whereas actually having a nice bottle that's branded nice, that looks like a bottle of wine, takes hopefully a lot of that away. And when you were in the really early stages and you kind of had the idea, was there a moment that you thought, if I don't do this now, somebody else might come along and build it?
I think it's a really, really interesting question. I think to the point I made earlier about not having a million ideas a minute, it was probably one of those ones where I was like, if I don't do this, I'm probably not going to have another idea for at least another 5 years. So I've got to kind of grab, like, this feels like a good opportunity. And shortly after kind of first conceptualizing the idea, I went on holiday with some friends, and there were kind of 8 to 10 of us sitting in a garden in Italy for a week, and I had a lot of time to chat to people to understand, like, would you drink, you know, what are your drinking habits? And some people didn't drink, some did, some were, you know, really tucking in, others were looking to drink less, and so you basically had this cross-section of opinions that fed into that idea. I think the other thing is, if you look at the wine industry, it's an industry that's rooted in tradition rather than innovation. And so it's actually pretty rare that you can get, well, people listening to this will probably think this is not rare at all, but it's a great opportunity to look at an industry where you're saying there's a lot of space for challenger brands.
Yeah.
And the incumbents are going to be slow to kind of pick up on the opportunity here. They're either going to be slow and do it because they feel they should, or they're just going to avoid it entirely because they think alcohol-free is horrible and an aberration and they don't want to do that. So that's a great opportunity for someone like me and a brand like Wednesday's Domaine.
Definitely. And if you had to explain kind of what makes your brand what it is today in an essence, a sentence, etc., how would you encompass that sentence? What would you say?
God, this is where I will be revealed to be an absolutely terrible founder and brand builder. I think, well, the way we position ourselves is we want to be the midweek wine alternative for food and drink lovers. And I think that point is really important, because what it's touching upon is that most of our customers do drink alcohol. They do like a glass of wine. And we're there for those moments where you're kind of unsure whether you should or not. And often that plays out in 2 ways. One is you either are really hankering for a glass of wine, and you spend all evening thinking about it, you don't do it, and the next morning you're like, oh, I feel great, I'm glad I didn't have that glass of wine. The other option is you do have the glass of wine, then you wake up the next day thinking a tiny bit fuzzy, not hungover, but you're a little bit like, oh, I've had a glass of wine. And so we offer that kind of best of both worlds. And I think being that midweek wine alternative for food and drink lovers really is kind of the essence of what we're about.
Yeah, definitely. It's having the kind of option.
Exactly.
It's a bit like when someone pushes something down your throat or an opinion, you don't want it. Whereas actually, if you position it as, look, don't cut out alcohol, but when you're not fancying it, or if it's a Monday, Tuesday, and you still want to have that feeling of having a glass, that's when you choose us.
Exactly.
And the alcohol-free market, as I alluded to earlier, there's so many options out there now, and one might say it's quite crowded. What would you say that maybe brands are getting wrong in this space?
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. I think there's probably two things that we see in the alcohol-free space that are really difficult. One is something that I've already touched upon, which is this really pushing the notion of 0-0 and emblazing alcohol-free or de-alcoholized or non-alcoholic on the front. I think, again, that puts people in a different mindset and suggests that it's a less than experience. And so I think actually branding something in a way that it's its own drink, it's its own unique product is really, really important. I think the other thing, and this is particularly true in wine over beers or spirits, is price. So the price in alcohol-free has been anchored unbelievably low. So if you go into a supermarket, a Tesco or a Sainsbury's, you will find own label alcohol-free wine for £2.50, £3. And rightly or wrongly, a lot of consumers, a lot of shoppers think price equals quality when it comes to wine. People rarely admit it, but they really shop on price and label when it comes to wine. And so if you've got a £3 alcohol-free wine, a lot of people just assume it's crap. And then they might buy it because the risk is quite low. It's £3, the same as a bottle of beer or something like that. But then they go home and they have a bad experience. So actually, in positioning ourselves as a premium alcohol-free wine, our bottle of still wine is £15. We have to fight against that all the time. So we have a job to do to explain why our product costs what it does, and going into the kind of sourcing of the base wines, the utilisation of the latest de-alcoholization technology, the additions afterwards, all that sort of stuff. But that's really hard when someone's listening to you and going, yeah, but I could buy one for £3. And it's only when you begin to taste the product and understand the brand that you get that.
And on that, how do you get people to buy into the brand? Because we, as a now, especially in a world of TikTok and Instagram, where you're fighting for attention, and also our attention span is 3 seconds on a reel, whatever. How do you get people to stay on your page or such as one example, or the time with the customer in terms of sampling to then get them to buy in? Because I think that is really hard now.
Yeah, it's unbelievably hard, and I think the answer, the simple answer, is there's no one thing that you do. You have to have a kind of a composite or a toolbox of kind of options or channels that you're using to contact and reach that customer. And it's interesting because we're a business that's been built direct to consumer and in the independent on and off trade, and we're now moving towards more mainstream retail and grocery. And actually so much of what we've done to date has been about the battle of getting on shelf, but actually it's won and lost in getting the products off the shelf. And so that's where we need to move, from doing something which could be considered quite niche and quite quirky through to kind of mainstream brand awareness. And that's a completely different set of challenges. But the way I would answer the question in terms of what we do at Wednesday's Domain is there's a huge amount of storytelling and narrative and long-form creative. We have 2 newsletters that we've written from day one. One's called Table Talk, one's called Picky Bits. And Table Talk celebrates all of the basically bollocks that you talk about around a table with your family and friends. It celebrates meandering conversations that don't really have a beginning or an end. And Picky Bits is little snippets. Did you see this? Have you seen that? And hopefully, there's over 20,000 people each week that receive those emails now, and the open rates are crazy. And that's because we're not selling people products. And we're not even selling them the brand of Wednesday's Domain. We're just trying to insert ourselves into their lives in a small but meaningful and joyous way.
I think the big word there is community.
Yeah, it is. And if Wednesday's Domain were to go to pot tomorrow, something I would be proud of is the way in which we've embraced that and really stuck with it. And the number of emails that I get back from people saying, this is utterly bizarre and comedy, but in a very loving and kind of positive way, really, that's the kind of thing that I'm very proud of, I'd say.
Definitely, and I think you've made a connection with someone else through your brand, and I think that's also a big thing for a founder, is that they've made that they've built that community, and that they haven't. Hopefully you'd like to think that person may have bought a product down the line, but if they haven't, you've caught their attention and you've managed to explain something that's important to you.
Yeah,
and I think that's also a really big part of kind of what you said as well.
Definitely.
And as I mentioned earlier, alcohol-free drinks do have a bit of a rep of tasting a bit crap, and I remember one experience that I had that was in a pub, and I don't know why I wasn't drinking, actually. I can't actually remember the reason, but I just didn't fancy a glass of wine. I didn't want any alcohol. But you're right, definitely didn't want a J2O because of how much sugar is in it. And don't get me wrong, I don't mind Diet Coke, but I maybe had one earlier in the day, so I didn't want another one or whatever. And it's not a very, like, fun drink to have with a group of mates. Like, it's just a DC in a ugly glass, isn't it? With some huge lemon wedges or whatever. It's not very nice.
It's been kicking around for a few days.
Yeah, I'm a bit over it. And they had an alcohol-free wine, and I was like, oh, do you know what? I'll grab a glass of that. Oh, my gosh. Firstly, the smell was so foul. Like fish skinny smell. Like, so grim. And then I had a taste, and my boyfriend kindly bought me the glass of wine, and I just thought, I can't drink that. And he was like, well, that's £6 or whatever it was. And I said, you try that. It was so bad. I thought, people can't be ordering this. Yeah. So how do you overcome that barrier, and why do alcohol-frees not taste as good? I mean, that's probably a stupid question because actually, duh. But why is there that taste issue?
Yeah, it's not a stupid question at all, and a big part of what we do is around education. And it's really interesting hearing you tell that story, Zoe, because when we are pitching and we are introducing ourselves to people, we always acknowledge that point first. We always say, alcohol-free wine has historically been terrible. In the same way that alcohol-free beer was once terrible, and people of a certain age will remember a product called Caliber, and they all have a kind of wry smile and a chuckle, and they're like, oh God, that was terrible, but now I love Lucky Saint, or Days, or Big Drop, or Guinness 0.0. That's changed completely to the extent where people have almost forgotten that Caliber used to be a thing. So to answer your question, why does alcohol-free taste so bad? I think, again, if you use beer as a reference point, in beer, the ABV is typically 4 to 5%. So when you're going down to 0.5 or 0, there's less change going on. And you also have the carbonation within beer, which helps lift the kind of experience in your mouth, essentially. So with wine, when you're talking 13 to 15% ABV, the alcohol is effectively the backbone of the product. So when you remove the alcohol, it almost like crumples in on itself. Like a lot of the flavours don't really work together anymore. So there's different ways you can approach this. You can either take wine and remove the alcohol from it, and people often put a load of sugar in it to give it body, but then it's really calorific and sweet, and it's overly cloying and not very nice. Or you can combine juices, ferments, teas, spices. I think the way that, I know the way that we do it sits somewhere in between. So we realise basically there are three things that are key to making a good alcohol-free wine. The sourcing of the base wines has to be really, really good. So you have to have delicious alcoholic wines you'd be chuffed to drink anyway. Then you need the latest dealcoholization technology. So we use a product that's incredibly gentle on the wine, because historically, again, wines have been effectively boiled to get the alcohol out of them. So you get this overly cooked note, which gives the smell that you're talking about. And then we have the additions afterwards. So we put in a tiny amount of juice afterwards, which helps to round out the profile of that dealcoholized wine and give it body, length, flavour, all the stuff that you associate with a wine, basically.
Okay, interesting. So it's actually like the dealcoholization of the wine that makes it give it that smell and that kind of tasting, because it's being boiled, essentially.
Exactly. So it's the treatment of the alcohol removal. Yeah. And there are various different ways that you can approach it. There are kind of three methods that people tend to use, but all of them, we believe currently, don't result in a product that you would be happy to take to market. We still think that you need some kind of alterations afterwards. And there are people in the market who would say, well, you're approaching it all wrong. You've got to go down the juices, ferments, teas, spices route. And those products are really interesting, but I don't think they meet the needs of wine drinkers at scale. I think if you're used to going to fancy restaurants and having all sorts of concoctions and whatever, they're great. But I think they're quite different to the experience of drinking a wine.
Yeah. And in terms of the category, do you think that we're still scratching the surface when it comes to alcohol-free? And what do you think we're going to see in the next 5 to kind of maybe 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a risk that we'll go through the next 10, 15, 20 years saying we're just scratching the surface of alcohol-free, because, when I started reading around the space 5 years ago, people were saying that, and they're still saying that. I think it's evolving pretty quickly, and I think as more options come to market, people are becoming ever more curious. I think what's interesting is you're seeing this kind of split in drinking habits, which is really based on age. So all of the headlines around people drinking less are that Gen Z don't drink. I think Gen Z drink more than people claim that they don't, basically. But the other thing is, our customer is not a Gen Z customer, because if you've not grown up drinking beer, wine, spirits, you're pretty unlikely, or you're as likely to have a functional soda as you are a non-alcoholic wine, because you haven't developed that taste or that preference for something like a wine. So our customer is slightly older and they want something more wine-like. So in terms of what that looks like over the next 5-10 years, I think you'll continue to see this blurring of category lines where people are taking from lots of different categories, but I think you'll also continue to see improvement in what I think sometimes uncharitably are called mimic products, like beers, wines, spirits, where actually the technology and the understanding allows you to create products which are truer to their original alcoholic counterpart, basically. And I think what you'll see is that you'll have no, low, full strength, and people will just move quite fluidly between them.
I think it will be like the way veganism happened, in the sense of, like, at first it was all cold turkey. Everybody went, like, literally overnight, right, meat, dairy went out the window, and everyone went really cold turkey. And, you know, Burger King brought out the plant-based Whopper, McDonald's had the vegan meal. Sorry, that's all gone very quiet, hasn't it? Plant-based meat's gone, like, we don't know where it's gone, basically. It's gone. And now it's like, do you know what? Let's go back to Whole Foods. Let's just eat our sweet potato and our chickpeas for dinner. We don't need that plant-based bit of meat. But then when I do fancy a bit of meat, I might, you know, have it twice a week versus the 7 days or whatever I was having it before. And I think there's been a whole, you know, movement within that category. I think it's the same with like alcohol-free wine, is that people would go cold turkey, like dry Jan. It was a whole month off. And of course people still do that. It's quite, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you just want to drink less, and this is where these products are really helpful.
Yeah, and it's I mean, this is a controversial opinion for an alcohol-free wine founder to hold, but I actually hate Dry January, because I think it's very all or nothing, and that is not what we espouse as a brand at all, and that's not how most consumers or individuals behave. You know, you want to be able to dip in and dip out. And I have one very specific friend that I think of whenever I think of Dry January, which is quite a lot, being in the space that I'm in. And he would turn up to stuff when we were in our 20s, and he was always so grumpy, because he was like, I cannot wait for the 1st of Feb because I can have a drink. And you're just looking at him, and I would have the conversation with him like, why are you doing this to yourself? And he would say, well, it's, you know, it's really good to reset and all that sort of stuff. But that's not how, you know, life's too short to live in that way. So I think it's really interesting to see that kind of, that understanding around balance and moderation. And again, moderation is a very unsexy word, but that is ultimately what a lot of people are tending towards.
Also, it does breed a bit of then a binge, I think. Like,
exactly.
If you restrain from something, say whether it's food, whether it is alcohol, if you say I'm not having it, and then the 1st of Jan comes around, what do? You're going to want to drink a lot. The 1st of Feb. And that's also a really bad way to look at something. Like, we should just enjoy it, and then when we don't fancy a drink, don't. But obviously moderation is really difficult, and hence why companies exist like Simflast, right? If we all just did that, these wouldn't be conglomerates. But yeah, like having that an all or nothing approach, I think it's kind of gone.
And it's interesting because we are actively exploring the low alcohol space. And low alcohol, particularly in wine, is unbelievably ill-defined. So, you know, if you go into a supermarket, a low-alcohol wine can be anywhere between 3 and 11%. And a few years ago, I would have said, low-alcohol wine, don't really get it, don't see the point. It's kind of a bit, you're either drinking or you're not. And actually what we're seeing now is people want to have that experience, but they do also want a bit of alcohol, because ultimately that does have an effect on your body, and it does, you know, in moderation, allow for a bit of relaxation. It has a, you know, physiological effect and all that sort of stuff. And so I think that will be a really interesting space as well. And that comes back to the point I made earlier about no, low, full strength. I think that's what you're beginning to see. And there are some great businesses in that space, particularly in spirits and beer. You know, you've got quarter proof in spirits, and you've got small beer and beer. They're doing some great things in that space. And those businesses, particularly small beer, have actually been around for a little while now, but they're like the growth curve they're on is accelerating because all of a sudden people are beginning to question these things.
And I know we've spoken about taste as like the biggest barrier here, but what would you say is one other big misconception about alcohol-free?
I think the biggest one is that it's for people need a reason, a very explicit reason to consume it. So people will often say, like, isn't that just for pregnant women or religious people or someone on medication? You're like, those may be reasons for that person to consume a non-alcoholic product. But actually, if you look at the vast majority of consumers, they're just looking for a different option, a better option at a certain moment. And, if I take the example of my own life, got a young daughter at home, running my own business, there are moments where I really fancy a drink, but I just can't afford the impact or the consequence of that. Or not that I can't afford it, it's that I'm not willing to compromise that.
Yeah.
So I'm like, actually, I want that experience of a glass of wine or a beer, and have done that multiple times this week already. But I don't want the alcohol, basically. So I think that's a massive misconception.
I totally agree. I think when you said that, I was like, yeah, when I think about alcohol-free, it's more like, or what's my reason? But actually, there shouldn't necessarily be a reason. It's just like, I don't want to drink.
And to something you mentioned earlier, you shouldn't have to explain it either. It should just, if someone's getting a round in or you're buying a round, it's like, can you get X, Y, Z? It shouldn't even be a question. And I think that's a future that we're moving towards relatively quickly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I really hope so, right? Because it is frustrating when you just don't want to drink and someone keeps asking and you're like, kind of said no, I'm just a bit done now. In terms of the early stages, so you've kind of got the concept and the idea. How did you go through the process to get it from initial idea to in someone's hand? Where did you go about sourcing? Because if you didn't come from that background, it must have been quite confusing in the beginning and understanding it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's massively confusing to start with. And the way that I started was, I mentioned right at the start that I helped run a community of entrepreneurs, helping them through the highs and lows of building a business. I knew a few people in that who were in food and drink. And so I gave them a ring and basically just said, like, how does this work? And one friend in particular who ran a pork scratching business, I was like, how do you make this happen? And he kind of put me onto food and drink and recipe developers, had conversations with a number of those types of people, ended up working with an agency based here in London, and they helped kind of conceptualize the product and bring that product to market. And there was a lot of testing, a lot of iterations. We then did a trial run with a third-party bottler or manufacturer. So for those that aren't familiar with that, that's as in we don't own those assets. We didn't suddenly buy a winery or buy a production facility. We kind of rented that capacity off someone else. And we did a trial run, and then we began to scale that up. And those were the first iterations of the wines that we had for about 12 to 18 months. Those products were good, but they weren't great for the time that, they were good for where the market was at the time, but they were never going to take us to the heights that we kind of want to scale. They were also incredibly difficult to make, and they were pretty costly. And so through that process, I realized that we needed to change the way that we did things. So quite quickly, we brought a consultant winemaker on board, and through that individual, we then ended up building relationships with wineries out in Spain that we now work with. So I'm sharing that story because where we began is very different to where we are now, and these things really do evolve. And also, there were elements within that process that I got wrong. So in the very early days, I was very anti working with winemakers because my belief was that they would be too fixed in how you should, in their mindset of how you should create a non-alcoholic wine, or just not want to create one, full stop. And actually, that was a mistake, and I was wrong. We did need a winemaker because we needed someone who really understood the kind of organoleptics around how you make a wine. But that person had also made beers, spirits, ciders, and so wasn't necessarily constrained by practices from winemaking.
Interesting. Yeah, how your perception has changed because initially, I see what you mean. You'd feel like there'd be a barrier.
Yeah.
But actually, they are the people that know exactly.
Really know their stuff.
Yeah,
really
definitely.
Know their stuff and have very, very specific knowledge. And actually, that's one of the most satisfying things about running a business. In my experience, which is, when you have quite a strong view on something and then you realize you're completely wrong, or, you're happy to change tact and you're like, actually, that's cool. Like, that was in the past and now we're going this way.
Definitely. Really interesting point, actually, I think. And, as an entrepreneur and founder, you're by default a risk taker, right? Like, you have to be. You've, quit a full-time job, you've left like a secure salary, and you've gone and taken the risk of starting your own business. What would you say to date has been the biggest risk you've taken within starting the business?
Yeah.
Obviously, starting the business was the biggest risk.
Yeah.
Once you had begun it.
I think that there are a few. And they're all very scary at the time. And what's interesting is, in hindsight, none of these things are that scary. But and so, in what I'm about to say, the way that I try and look at things now is like, in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year, will I be stressed by this? And if the answer is no, try not to be stressed by it now. So, good example of that is, I hired someone on a contract basis very early on a massive day rate to help me work out how to, construct our margin tree and our value chain and set up a third-party fulfillment center and our website and all that sort of stuff. And I wasn't paying myself at the time. I was kind of looking at a dwindling savings balance, and they were, getting paid quite a lot of money. But the business wouldn't have launched in the way that it did without that individual. So committing to someone who really knew their stuff and dedicating quite a lot of the very little money we had to that was a big risk at the time, but makes complete sense once you do it. Very, very similar story with our branding. Over half of the money that we raised to launch the business went on our brand, went on the visual identity. And in some respects, that's slightly mad, but actually that is the one thing that almost unanimously people love.
Yeah, it's the first thing I said.
And I think it has a very distinct brand identity, and so I don't regret spending that money at all. So those are kind of two risks quite early on. A third risk, which I know you asked for the biggest, but I'll give you the top three, basically. The third risk is probably, again, how you finance the business. And early on, I was lucky to have a good network within startups, but I raised money from people that I knew and had good, and in some cases, friendly relationships with. And that can really risk shifting a friendship and a relationship. So putting at risk those personal relationships through taking someone's hard-earned money and admittedly giving them a slice of your business, that is quite scary at the time. But the way that I kind of sought to mitigate that risk was, everyone who I knew in a personal capacity who put money in, I said to them, this is separate to our friendship. If ever you want to have a conversation about the business, we can. I'll always make time to have that conversation, but please don't bring it up at a barbecue, at a dinner, when we've had 6 pints. Like, I don't want to talk about it there and then. And I think in putting those guardrails around those investment decisions, it's actually worked really well.
Because starting a business with a friend or them giving you money can be quite tricky territory, because it can really, it can make or break a friendship for sure. So I think that's a really, really good one to say, to have the boundaries in place. And success, I think, is measured in so many different ways by so many different people. It might be, winning that listing that you've wanted forever. That's your success. That's your North Star. It might be getting the business off the ground, just like, oh my God, I made it through today. What's been your biggest success to date, and how would you say you would measure success in terms of bigger goals and then maybe short-term goals?
I think our biggest success is still being here 3 years later. And if someone asks me, what's the strategy for the business, I'm just like, don't die. Like, that is number one strategy for the business.
Physically don't die. Yeah, and then secondly, business don't die.
Exactly. So all of those things, and obviously that's a kind of pithy answer, and I'm slightly taking the piss, but that is absolutely the biggest success, because setting up a business is brutal. Setting up a business in food and drink is doubly brutal, because it's so competitive. So being here 3 and a bit years after launch is absolutely our biggest success. To answer your question about long-term success, short-term success, it's, we could dive into kind of metrics and goals and all those sorts of things, but I think actually it's about constantly realigning what your measure of success is. And actually, I was speaking with the founder of another FMCG business the other day, and she said to me, back in the day, I said, if we get into Waitrose and then the business blows up, I will die happy. And she was like, the moment we got into Waitrose, I wanted to get into Sainsbury's and Tesco's.
Yeah, that's classic life, isn't it?
And this is someone who is raising money, about to raise quite a lot of money from a private equity firm. So to even be in that league, she's already built a big business. And that just kind of encapsulated this whole notion of we always want more. We always want more. So I think success is a movable feast. And the way that I would define it comes back to something I said earlier around having made a large number of people feel something, whether that's part of being part of a moment, or it's picking up a bottle and thinking it's beautiful. That, creating those customer experiences at scale, that for me is success, I would say.
Definitely, and it goes back to that community. I think that will be like the new wave of marketing. It won't be like traditional marketing. It'll be like, have you got a community? Have you got buy-in to your brand?
Yeah.
And if there was something that was to keep you up at night about your business, what would it be?
It is funny. I think about this a lot. Actually, not late at night because I'm asleep. I sleep pretty well. I'm very lucky in that respect. I've recently started using magnesium butter on my feet, which makes me sound like a lunatic.
But it helps.
It's unbelievable. As in, I've had to stop using it because I sleep too much, too well. But if there's one thing, it's cash. Like every founder, every business owner, any one you speak to who is in a senior position in a business will say the two things that always keep them awake are cash and people. And we have a relatively small team. So for me, the answer is cash. And it's all about... and running an FMCG business or a food and drink business is hard because in what we do, you can have a decent amount of money in your bank account, in your business bank account, and then you put a load of it in stock and you're waiting to sell it. So that interim period can be pretty terrifying. And so that's the biggest thing, absolutely.
Definitely, I mean, cash is king, right?
Yeah.
Like your cash flow is what keeps you alive.
Exactly.
And you touched upon then about your team, and we were speaking earlier before we started on the podcast about team and how important the team is. It is, who you bring in early stages basically defines culture and how your business kind of turns out in day to day. So how do you go about the hiring process, and what would you say in marketing is something you look for, and then what would you say in sales is something you look for?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing of anyone joining a startup is comfort in uncertainty, and the fact that the plan is going to change all the time. And that doesn't mean the strategy is going to change, but it means the tactics that you use and the plan that you that plays out to get there will change and will evolve a lot. So comfort and uncertainty is a big one. The other thing which we touched on previously is the ability to see around corners and the ability to think 2-3 steps ahead. And that's not me sitting here claiming I'm some kind of savant that can see around corners and all that sort of stuff. But it's just thinking through decisions and the impact, the second and third order consequences is absolutely massive. When it comes to marketing, we don't actually have anyone in-house who does marketing. We have a marketing agency that we work with called Brand Hackers. And what I realized quite early on is that marketing is incredibly multidisciplinary, if that's a word, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And so it's incredibly hard to find someone who can do all of that. So we have someone who's brilliant at organic social, but that skill set's very different to paid social, which is very different to email marketing, which is very different to kind of community and affiliates. So actually in having a marketing person, we don't have a marketing person, basically. When it comes to sales, I think it is... ability to put the work in. Sales is brutal, as you know. You have to be willing to pick up the phone, and also you have to be able to connect with different people in different ways.
Yeah.
So what someone might be a million miles an hour, and equally someone may be more considered, and you have to find ways to connect with both of those. And someone might buy based on vibes and someone might buy based on data, and you have to be able to move between those two arguments. And I think the best salespeople can combine those together, but that's incredibly rare, I would say. And the difficulty in hiring salespeople is they're often quite good at selling. So they're very good at selling themselves. And so they'll promise you the world, and then the reality can be quite different.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting point. I think, yeah, people that are good at all what you've just said in terms of sales or in terms of marketing, they also, you're right, they are rare, right? So then once you do a really good job somewhere, you might get noticed and then people come and head. So it's also maybe hard to keep them in the business.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because I was at an event for Ocado recently, and number of founders there, but then also team members. And actually what you were finding was that the best people in those teams were kind of 2-3 years in, and they had a tiny bit of experience, so that they kind of knew what they were doing, but equally they were just super hungry, very adaptable, very resourceful. And that was fascinating. And I think, for me, in an ideal world, the way you would structure a business is you'd have a couple of relatively experienced operators, and then you'd have a bigger group of junior, very hungry, very resourceful, very energetic people who you can shape and mould and kind of ultimately you want to see them push on to bigger and better things. Basically.
Definitely. And I think the biggest thing is energy.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's something you can teach.
Yeah.
I think you come into a business with a load of it, or you don't, ultimately. Yeah. And if you don't, you're probably best based in a corporate.
Yeah.
If you have loads of energy and you've got loads to give and you're hungry for it, then you're definitely in the right place for a startup. Yeah. Not to say that corporate people shouldn't come into small businesses, because I think when the business gets to that size, they do need that strategy, longer term thinking. But I think for day to day, you need doers.
Yeah.
And that is what moves the dial when it comes to small biz. Yeah,
and it's also interesting because I think within startups, a lot of people can be quite disparaging of corporates. But certainly what I've seen, I remember being at an event years ago when I first moved into startups, and one of the founders of HelloFresh was there, and he had been a corporate lawyer. And someone said in quite a tongue-in-cheek way, what did a corporate ever teach you? And he was like, to turn up on time, to present myself, to write an email.
Yeah.
Those three things are really, really important. And I think sometimes in startups, particularly in food and drink, which is rooted in hospitality and good times and all that sort of stuff, we all risk being a bit casual. And actually there's a lot to be said for being a bit more structured in your approach, how you present yourself, how you articulate certain things, going back to that point around knowing who you're speaking to and who you're selling to. There are absolutely things that corporates do teach people very well.
I think that's exactly it. It's being moldable.
Yeah.
It's being able to mold yourself into the situation that you're in, that you maybe do need corporate backing to help you with that.
Yeah.
But you also need that, right, these guys are not going to buy data, they're buying people here, and that's where you can turn that on.
And to give you very practical examples there, there'll be people that we sell to that like, put that in an email to me, and can you summarize that in a table with some bullet points? And someone else, you'd be like, right, what's your phone number? And I'm going to WhatsApp that to you. And then you're on WhatsApp comms with them. And you can get to the same outcome, but they're actually, they want to work in different ways, which personally is a nightmare, because now I never actually respond to anyone in my personal life because my phone is full of WhatsApps for work. But that is the industry that we're in.
Definitely. I could not survive without WhatsApp for business, I don't think.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I'm very online a lot of the time. And, times always get hard. You're going to have your highs, you're going to have your lows. And we all have really manic weeks, and we will have really good weeks and we're quiet weeks, etc. How do you keep your team motivated in times that are really hard? Because as a founder, you've got to always show maybe that things are okay and not let that trickle in.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first thing I'd say, which probably disqualifies me from answering this properly, is that we have a relatively small team, and there are lots of agencies and freelancers around that. And I think one of the hardest things, if you're building in that way, is keeping everyone informed and on the same page, and people not feeling like there's this asymmetry of information where she knows more than I know, and or they know more than I know, and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's really, really hard. I think the way that I approach things, and it's very specific to the individual, is I err on the side of transparency and just saying, this is really hard and this is really difficult, or admitting that you don't know, but equally showing that you're committed to working it out. And then that comes back to resourcefulness and right, who can I ring to help me work this out? So I think in hard times, it comes down to transparency and commitment to working through it, because there are very, very few things that in a business that you can't work through, or that actually don't resolve themselves in time. And again, we touched upon this when we were chatting beforehand. There's something to be said for just like letting things sit sometimes. And there's a lot of stuff that lands in my inbox that my initial reaction is, oh my God, like, wow. And then actually I just sit with it for a bit and it just goes away, or it resolves itself, or it's not as big a problem as you thought it would be. But I think there are various iterations of this statement, but it's like, I think the founder of Gosney, Tom Gosney, said that once you realise that business is a series of inbound missiles aiming for your head, you begin to relax. And that is it every day. Something changes or goes wrong, or you wake up and like, today's going to be a good day. First thing that lands in your inbox or your WhatsApps, as we're saying, is something that's gone wrong. And you just have to recognise that that's the default, basically.
Yeah, for sure. But I think also as a leader and a founder, you've got to thrive in those environments as well. Because if you're not a thriver in stress, it's kind of not what I'm trying. I guess it's not really what I mean. In the sense you shouldn't thrive in a stressful environment, but you need to be able to adapt and go, right, I'm going to take a step back and work through this versus going, oh my gosh, this is too much.
And that is absolutely spot on, Zoe. And I'll give you. So when I left, I mentioned at the start very briefly that I was a commodities trader for 3 years, worked for a big American company, and we were shipping stuff all around the world. And when I left, I was like, I do not want to do anything in physical product ever again, because it always breaks or goes missing or goes off or whatever. So moved across into tech, and when I was working at one of the tech startups, I was cycling in one day, I was thinking nothing's gone wrong in ages, and actually it's a bit boring. And I got in and I got a phone call from a customer, and they were like, XYZ is a big problem. And I remember feeling so alive in that moment and being like so energized by it. And it was almost like that, as you've kind of just done, like, right, come over here, we're going to sort this out. What's going on there? And you kind of get everyone around you and you work through it. It's problem solving. And you're right, you do have to thrive in that. Yeah. Albeit it would be nice every so often to have a day or a week where there weren't some problems.
But as founders, I think, especially in small businesses, and especially with, if you're coming from like a massive VC backed as a founder startup, you're probably okay because things can survive themselves when you've got lots of cash behind you. But when you're when you're on like those really early days, you have to be able to thrive in those environments or your business won't last.
Exactly.
And you probably might not go through it.
Yeah, exactly.
And looking into the future and like what you want to leave behind with Wednesday's Domain, do you think there is a kind of exit strategy down the line, or are you in it for the long game? And you might not even, you're right, as you said earlier, there might not be an answer for this. It might not, might not know yet, but looking at businesses, ultimately, obviously, one day, would you like to leave it to your daughter and your baby that's on the way, or would it be more of I would like to exit at some point?
I have gone back and forth on this answer. Which is probably not what you want to hear if you're an investor in Wednesday's Domain. But ultimately, I do think that you're looking to create value in a business. You're looking to build something that can stand on its own 2 feet. And if you do that, someone may well come along and buy it. But that is kind of down the line. So I think in the short term, in the interim, we're trying to build something that is self-sustaining, is profitable, and then you have options. I think ultimately, I probably would like to see that go on and be part of another business. Because I think as a startup and as a challenger brand, you are limited in what you can achieve by resources and scale. And some people would find that view quite depressing and say that's a very British view, and British founders are always accused of exiting too early or not thinking big enough. But actually, having begun to build relationships with people in big drinks businesses, the scale that you can achieve with someone like that behind you is unbelievable. And I also think it's an interesting time because the food and drink and the beverage landscape is changing. You're getting these kind of modern drinks brands that have alcohol, non-alcoholic. Look in the US, there's kind of THC and CBD beverages. There's all sorts of routes for a business like Wednesday's Domain. I think on a personal level, there are other businesses that I would love to set up in time. Not now. I'm wholly committed to Wednesday's Domain, and that's what gets me through the tough days. When I'm really having a brutally bad day, I think, well, what else would I be doing? I love what I'm doing. This is me for the next 5, 10, however many years. But in time, I can see Wednesday's Domain being part of something else.
And where do you see the business in 10 years?
Good question. I think we will... So I said at the start that we are the midweek wine alternative for food and drink lovers. I think that will probably evolve into either a very modern wine business or a very modern drinks business. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of stuff in the media about how the death of wine and that wine consumers are aging and they're not being replaced by younger consumers. I think the way in which we drink wine is changing. And I think that Wednesday's Domaine can become a business that can offer that full suite of products, whether wine-based or not, to a drinker. So we can have something for those moments where you don't want to drink, those moments where you think, I'd love a glass or I'd love a little bit, and there's moments where you want to get fully stuck in. And so I can see us being a business that can cater to all of those things at a, on a global level, I think.
I find that question so interesting when I ask founders, because it's so varied of what they come out with. Some people have a very clear exit strategy. Some people are, in it day to day, following their nose, being what will happen will happen. I know that, as you said, you're so invested at the time.
Yeah.
And others are committed in it for the long haul. They're like, no, this is a family business. I want to be the next Marks and Spencer of tradition and family. So
and it's interesting because it would be interesting to chart those answers against the outcomes over the years and
do
see
that.
And you should definitely do that, because you'll have some amazing answers, and that would be fascinating to know. It's also interesting if you are second or third time founders, that question, I'm sure, and that will be determined by whether they had a good outcome first time round. I know someone at the minute who's building a brewery, and they'd made a lot of money in a previous business, in a property business. And when you talk to them about what's the ambition, they're like, I want to build something that's here in 100 years. And I want to build a business that the area in which I live is proud of. We've built a community, and we've provided jobs, and we've, the same people who brew the beer, drink the beer, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's an amazing thing. But their mindset is very different because they have grown-up children, they've got money in their bank account. They can build in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you also have to... Yeah, that is... I'd love to say I'm going to, leave a business that will be in 100 years, but you need something that would almost, change the game when it comes to that, because... Or even, leave a little bit of a mark on the world. Have, worldwide distribution. I'm thinking of, a legacy of, a Coca-Cola or, a Fuller's, where it is, real big business.
Yeah. And I think that's a great motivation to have, to leave a mark. And that's what I was saying to you earlier about how do I, you ask how do you define success? It's about making people feel something. And, we now have distribution in Australia. And a mate of mine from London who now lives in Melbourne sent me a picture of some Wednesday's Domaine in a fridge in Melbourne and then on his kitchen table in Melbourne.
Aww.
And that blew my mind.
Yeah.
The fact that it's pretty much as far away as you can get from the UK. There's a bottle of Wednesday's Domaine. And that comes back to your personal motivations and why do you do things. For me, physical products, delightful customer experiences. And that was happening in his kitchen, the other side of the world. And so that is some form of legacy already.
Definitely.
And so, it's a fascinating question. I could talk to you about it at length.
Yeah. And we spoke a little bit about this earlier, but if you can kind of summarise, if the company fell tomorrow, what would you be the most proud of?
It's a really hard question to answer because, again, I think as a founder, particularly as a British founder, you see all the things that have gone wrong, or the things that haven't quite worked, or the things that are really hard. What would I be most proud of? I would be proud of the fact that we've built brand awareness and a reputation in a category that was otherwise pretty downtrodden, pretty staid, pretty boring, very unloved, and we've really made people feel something. We've made thousands, if not tens of thousands of customers now feel something in purchasing our product, and whether that's feel part of a moment or, I speak a lot about we're not a brand that's for people who don't drink. But there's a lot of people who are going through things in their lives that have had a glass of Wednesday's Domaine, and they've emailed us and they've said, this has been amazing for X, Y, Z reason. So I think that's what I'd be most proud of. So
to wrap up the interview, I've got some quick fire round questions. First drink you ever loved? Yeah.
I think you can't get away from a Shirley Temple.
That word in so long.
if it was an alcoholic drink, I would say like a Passoa, something ridiculous, like a friend bringing some of that back from a Spanish exchange and being like, you got to get your chops around this. This is unbelievable.
So funny. One founder you'd like to swap places for a day?
I was saying to you earlier, I always freeze with this sort of question. So I was thinking about this on the way here. There's a business called Gravity Industries set up by a guy, I think it's called Richard Browning. He's an ex-Marine, and it's a jetpack business. And you always see him in the paper like once every year or two, kind of flying around Canary Wharf with a jetpack on. And I'm like, that just looks unbelievable.
Yeah, that does sound
and
very
I think
cool.
he's pretty rare in as much as he's, created these jetpacks, but also he's doing all the deals and all that sort of stuff. So I think I'd probably have a day in his shoes.
Yeah.
Or in his jetpack, maybe.
Yeah, in his jetpack. Biggest pet peeve in business?
Again, potentially controversial opinion, but it kills me when people say we've got a no dickheads policy, because that's often a massive red flag to me. When people talk about that, I find that quite hard.
Is that not just an obvious?
Yeah, that's exactly that is a much better way of summarising, a much better articulate summary than the one I provided. The other thing is nice to meet you.
We're so over that.
When you get introduced over
nice
email, I think that's
meet.
just a shocker. Just say lovely to be introduced or pleasure to be introduced.
Yeah, please don't use e-meet.
E-meet.
That's an ick.
Anything is a big ick.
That is a business ick. And we've kind of talked about this one, I guess. Finish the sentence for me. Success for me means...
Yeah, still being here.
Yeah,
still being here.
here.
That is it. And I really, at risk of sounding like a broken record, I think unless you've done it or unless you've seen it up close, you can't understand or appreciate what it takes of you and what it takes of the people around you. And so I think still doing it, still being here as a business is absolutely what success is.
Definitely. And actually, I've just thought of another one. If you could go back to the early days, what would you have changed kind of to get you maybe a bit further down the line now, or maybe something that went wrong?
Yeah, I mean, what would I change? I would probably push myself to move quicker and think bigger earlier. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to go bigger earlier, because there's a lot of things that whether that's retail distribution or national distribution or whatever it is, that can come and you might not be ready for them as a business. But I think I would back myself more, and I would think bigger earlier and move quicker, basically. And that's coming from someone and a business that has moved, but in the grand scheme of things, pretty quickly already.
Yeah, exactly. You're very reactive already, but even quicker.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Luke, for
Thank
coming
you for having
on
me.
Getting to Go. It's been so interesting learning about all the wine that I was actually drinking this week. And as a big thank you, we got the new Getting to Go merch, which
Amazing.
is definitely yours to keep.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted. As I said to you, I'm on the lookout for a hat, so this is perfect.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Repping that all over the world.
Of course,
on holidays.
on my way home.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.